Picture the emergency sirens suddenly blaring across Washington, D.C. tonight. But when the generals frantically check the massive military radar screens, they find absolutely zero Russian missiles, no Chinese warships, and no foreign drones. The ultimate world-ending threat isn't crossing the ocean right now. It is actually walking directly out of your neighbor's front door. For decades, we have spent trillions building the most lethal, impenetrable military fortress in human history to protect us from outside monsters, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that our own foundation is violently rotting beneath our feet. We are not going to be conquered by a foreign army. We are going to systematically, deliberately destroy ourselves from the inside out. Today, I am going to show you the ancient, undeniable prophecies proving that the greatest empire in history is currently committing national suicide, and absolutely no one is coming to save us. When we think about the sudden collapse of a massive, globally dominant superpower, our minds immediately go to Hollywood action movies. We picture skies darkened by foreign fighter jets, massive naval fleets invading our peaceful coastlines, and foreign boots marching down our quiet suburban streets. It is incredibly easy to believe that the only thing capable of taking down the greatest nation on Earth is an equally massive, terrifying outside force. We feel incredibly safe, sitting behind two giant oceans, trusting our advanced radar systems to catch any incoming threat before it ever reaches our homes. But if you actually dust off the history books, you will quickly realize that the greatest empires never die from a sudden outside attack. Let's look at the ancient Roman Empire, which is arguably the closest historical equivalent to our modern superpower status. Most people falsely assume that a bunch of tough, angry barbarians just woke up one day, marched over the hills, and aggressively kicked the heavy iron doors down. The actual reality of their massive collapse is far more embarrassing and, honestly, a lot more terrifying for us today. By the time those foreign invaders finally breached the majestic city walls, Rome was already completely destroyed from the inside out. The once mighty empire was drowning in unimaginable national debt. Their political leaders were constantly stabbing each other in the back, and the citizens were fiercely divided. They were far more obsessed with violent entertainment, political drama, and personal comfort than they were with actually maintaining the core foundations of their own civilization. They didn't lose a grand military battle. They simply rotted away until they essentially handed the keys over to their enemies. Now let's take that uncomfortable historical mirror and hold it right up to our own modern faces for a second. We have spent the last 80 years building the most expensive, technologically advanced, and lethal military apparatus in the entire history of human civilization. We can literally track a single enemy drone from the other side of the planet with absolute, terrifying pinpoint precision. But all of that heavy external armor completely blinds us to a very dark, undeniable reality happening right inside our own borders. We are essentially living inside a massive, beautifully painted wooden mansion that looks absolutely stunning to anyone driving by on the street. But behind the fresh coat of paint, deep inside the walls where nobody wants to look, the termites have completely hollowed out our structural foundation. We're so busy scanning the distant horizon for foreign enemies and overseas threats that we completely ignore the massive, dangerous cracks rapidly forming directly under our own feet. We are parading our military strength while our actual society crumbles. You see, the ancient texts explicitly warn us that a house divided against itself cannot possibly stand, no matter how thick its outer walls are. When the core is completely rotten, you don't even need a massive foreign army to come in and do the heavy lifting for you. A single, well-placed gust of wind is more than enough to bring the entire majestic structure crashing down into a pile of worthless dust. And the scariest part is that we don't need an enemy to create that destructive wind. We have actually engineered it ourselves. Let's be completely honest for a second. Nobody actually wakes up in the morning wanting to despise the person living right across the street. But somehow we have found ourselves trapped in an incredibly toxic environment where hating your neighbor has practically become a national sport. It honestly feels like someone flipped a massive invisible switch, instantly turning friendly communities into hostile, heavily guarded political war zones. We used to be able to passionately disagree about taxes or foreign policy over a backyard barbecue and still remain great friends at the end of the day. Now, crossing an imaginary political line is treated like a massive, unforgivable act of treason, instantly severing lifelong relationships and tearing families completely apart. This extreme, boiling level of animosity didn't just happen by some weird, unfortunate accident. It was actually carefully and intentionally engineered. You see, we have been artificially split into two completely separate, fiercely opposing alternate realities that simply do not overlap anymore. Depending on which screen you stare at all day, you are being fed a highly customized, emotionally charged diet of absolute panic and relentless outrage. The mainstream networks and alternative media algorithms have perfectly weaponized our deepest fears, constantly telling us that the other side is trying to destroy our way of life. It is a brilliant, incredibly wicked strategy of divide and conquer, perfectly designed to keep us constantly at each other's throats. While we are aggressively screaming at our fellow citizens over social media posts, we are completely ignoring the actual people pulling the strings behind the heavy curtain. We have essentially become unwitting pawns in a massive high-stakes game of psychological chess, blindly fighting our brothers and sisters while the real enemy sits back and laughs. To really wrap your head around how dangerously effective this mental conditioning is, just imagine locking two people inside the exact same living room. You hand one person a tablet playing a breaking news report that screams, "The house is currently burning down to the ground." Then you hand the second person a different tablet with an urgent broadcast warning them that a massive, deadly flood is rapidly filling the room. Both individuals are sitting in the exact same physical space, but their minds are completely trapped in two wildly different, terrifying emergencies. If the guy preparing for a flood tries to smash a window to let the water out, the guy preparing for a fire will violently attack him to stop the oxygen from feeding the flames. They are both genuinely trying to save their own lives, but because their perceived realities are completely opposite, they end up destroying each other in the process. That living room scenario is the exact terrifying reality of our modern society right now, playing out on a massive nationwide scale every single day. We are all utterly convinced that we are the righteous heroes, desperately trying to save a sinking ship, while viewing half of the country as the malicious villains drilling holes in the hull. This incredibly deep level of psychological division completely bypasses our logical brains and taps directly into our primal, hardwired survival instincts. When you genuinely believe that your neighbor's political vote is a direct, existential threat to your children's future, basic civility just flies right out the window. You stop seeing them as fellow citizens who simply hold different opinions, and you start viewing them as dangerous, unpredictable enemies that must be neutralized. It is a deeply toxic mindset that completely eradicates empathy, replacing it with a cold, relentless desire for absolute political domination. If you look at this through a deeply spiritual and prophetic lens, the absolute brilliance of this dark strategy is honestly chilling. The ancient enemy of human souls knows perfectly well that he doesn't need to physically manifest terrifying demons to completely destroy a powerful, well-armed nation. He doesn't need to launch fiery missiles from the sky or summon a massive foreign army to violently break down our heavy gates. All he really has to do is systematically destroy the concept of a shared, objective truth, and the entire civilization will naturally implode. Once we can no longer agree on basic, fundamental facts, the social contract completely shatters, and the heavy chains holding back pure anarchy simply snap. We are eagerly burning down our own house, completely oblivious to the fact that someone else quietly handed us the matches and the gasoline. But psychological manipulation and media-driven hatred are really just the dry, highly combustible kindling carefully stacked underneath the foundations of a society. In order to actually ignite a massive, uncontrollable inferno that burns a superpower to ashes, you need a very specific, incredibly powerful catalyst to spark the flame. People will bitterly argue and yell at each other online all day long, but they rarely take to the streets with torches while their bellies are full. The true breaking point only arrives when the comfortable illusion of infinite prosperity shatters, leaving desperate families staring into a terrifying abyss. When the invisible weight of a collapsing system suddenly crushes the middle class, all those engineered political grievances rapidly morph into sheer, violent desperation. It really forces us to look at our fragile wallets and ask what happens when the invisible fuel of economic desperation is finally poured over this massive, raging political fire. Let's be real for a second. We love to pretend that our modern civilization is this unbreakable, permanent fixture that will just keep humming along forever. But the truth is, our polite society is incredibly fragile, hanging on by a rapidly fraying thread of economic stability and cheap credit. We are watching the complete, systematic evaporation of the middle class right before our eyes, replaced by a terrifying gap between the ultra-rich and the desperately poor. People are working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water, while the cost of basic groceries and rent absolutely skyrockets out of control. It is an incredibly exhausting, soul-crushing treadmill that leaves millions of hard-working families feeling like they are constantly drowning in a sea of invisible debt. When you strip away the illusion of the American dream, you are left with a massive powder keg of financial anxiety just waiting for a single match. You see, there is a very dark, unspoken rule among emergency management experts that says humanity is only ever about 9 meals away from total, absolute anarchy. As long as the grocery store shelves are fully stocked and the credit cards keep swiping, everyone acts like a perfectly civilized, law-abiding neighbor. But if the supply chains suddenly freeze or hyperinflation turns your life savings into completely worthless paper, that thin veneer of modern politeness vanishes in exactly 72 hours. When a father cannot afford to buy a loaf of bread to feed his hungry children, he doesn't care about political parties, social etiquette, or the evening news. The primal instinct to survive completely overrides all of our modern social conditioning, transforming perfectly normal, everyday citizens into desperate, unpredictable people willing to do anything. It is a terrifying, deeply uncomfortable reality that most folks simply refuse to acknowledge until the hunger actually knocks loudly on their own front door. What makes this impending economic fracture so incredibly dangerous is the staggering, unprecedented concentration of wealth sitting at the very top of the pyramid. It honestly feels like the system is heavily rigged, where the billionaire class gets massive bailouts, while the average guy gets a foreclosure notice taped to his door. This isn't just a political talking point. It is a recipe for deep, explosive resentment that historically always ends in violent, chaotic revolutions. When the masses feel like they have absolutely nothing left to lose, the elite's gated communities and offshore bank accounts suddenly become massive, glowing targets. You simply cannot maintain a peaceful, functioning democracy when half the country is struggling to afford basic electricity while the other half is building luxury spaceships. The sheer arrogance of this wealth divide acts like high-octane gasoline poured directly onto the already burning fires of our cultural and political divisions. If you dive into the prophetic texts, specifically the book of Revelation, you will find this exact economic nightmare described with chilling, absolute precision. When the third seal is dramatically broken, a black horse rides out, carrying a rider holding a set of weighing scales in his dark hand. The ancient text describes a scenario where a single quart of wheat, just enough food to keep one person alive for one day, costs an entire day's wages. It is a stunning 2,000-year-old description of crippling hyperinflation, where the working class literally works themselves to the bone just to afford a piece of bread. Meanwhile, the verse explicitly commands not to harm the oil and the wine, which were the luxury goods exclusively enjoyed by the ultra-wealthy elite of that time. The prophet wasn't just predicting a random famine. He was seeing a global economic system designed to crush the poor while perfectly protecting the billionaires. When you finally connect these ancient dots to our current banking crises and soaring inflation rates, the absolute gravity of the situation hits you hard. We aren't just dealing with bad economic cycles or incompetent politicians making poor fiscal decisions. We are watching a prophetic timeline unfold right in our wallets. The financial system is being deliberately squeezed to create maximum dependency, pushing millions of independent, self-reliant families straight into the arms of massive government relief programs. It is an incredibly brilliant, sinister strategy to force people to completely trade their personal freedoms for a simple, government-issued digital food ration. If you can completely control how people buy, sell, and eat, you essentially hold their absolute survival in the palm of your hand. It makes you realize that the real war isn't being fought with bullets and bombs, but with interest rates, digital currencies, and supply chain bottlenecks. But a purely economic collapse, as devastating as it is, still isn't quite enough to completely obliterate a nation that was once the shining city on a hill. Throughout history, societies have endured horrific depressions, massive famines, and total financial ruin. Yet they still managed to stick together and eventually rebuild from the ashes. They survived those incredibly dark times because they possessed a deep, shared foundation that was much stronger than their bank accounts or their political affiliations. There was an invisible, powerful glue holding the community together, giving them a collective purpose and a reason to sacrifice for the greater good of their neighbors. To truly destroy a superpower from the inside out, you don't just drain their bank accounts. You have to completely shatter that invisible, foundational glue. It really begs the terrifying question: what happens to a starving, desperate nation when the very core of its shared identity is intentionally ripped right out of the ground? If you look back at the actual blueprint of this massive, incredibly successful American experiment, you will find a very specific, undeniable cornerstone holding it all together. Whether people today love it or absolutely hate it, this nation was explicitly built upon a bedrock of shared Judeo-Christian principles and a deep moral framework. For hundreds of years, that specific spiritual foundation acted as the invisible, heavy-duty glue that kept over 300 million incredibly diverse people living in relative peace. It provided a universal standard of right and wrong, allowing neighbors with completely different backgrounds to essentially agree on the basic rules of human decency. Even if you never stepped foot inside a church, that cultural compass quietly guided the way communities interacted, raised their children, and resolved their personal disputes. But over the last few decades, we have aggressively taken a sledgehammer to that exact cornerstone, completely shattering the only thing that actually bound us together. You see, human beings are fundamentally wired to worship and follow a higher authority, and when you forcefully remove God from the public square, a massive vacuum is instantly created. Nature absolutely abhors a vacuum, so something else immediately rushes in to fill that massive, empty space in the human heart and the cultural hierarchy. In our modern, highly secular society, the almighty, all-powerful government has completely stepped up to take the place of that discarded divine authority. People now look directly to politicians and state institutions to provide their ultimate sense of morality, absolute security, and personal salvation from the chaos of life. The state essentially becomes the new secular religion, demanding absolute loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and total submission to its constantly changing set of cultural commandments. We have traded a timeless moral compass for the shifting, incredibly corrupt whims of Washington bureaucrats, expecting them to somehow save us from ourselves. This massive shift in our cultural worship is exactly where the internal ticking time bomb of our society truly begins to arm itself for a catastrophic explosion. When the government is elevated to the status of a supreme moral authority, every single political election suddenly becomes an apocalyptic life-or-death spiritual battle. If your political party loses power, you don't just feel like you lost a policy debate. You genuinely feel like an evil, destructive force has conquered your entire world. Half of the country wakes up every morning absolutely despising the very institution that is now dictating the moral boundaries of their everyday lives. You simply cannot maintain a stable, peaceful civilization when a massive portion of the population views the ruling government as an illegitimate, tyrannical, and deeply immoral occupying force. It is a recipe for absolute disaster, completely transforming standard political disagreements into vicious, uncompromising holy wars fought right in our own neighborhoods. Without that shared, objective moral baseline to anchor our conversations, we literally lose the ability to reason with each other or find any common ground. When truth becomes completely subjective and everyone simply follows their own personal version of reality, basic dialogue instantly breaks down into a screaming match. We no longer debate ideas with the goal of finding a better solution. We viciously attack each other's character with the sole intention of completely destroying our opponents. The concept of grace, forgiveness, and understanding has been entirely erased from our culture, replaced by a ruthless, unforgiving mob mentality that demands absolute ideological purity. If you step even an inch out of line with the current cultural dogma, you are immediately publicly crucified, cancelled, and completely banished from polite society. This terrifying lack of grace completely suffocates any hope of national unity, ensuring that our internal wounds never actually get the chance to heal. When a society completely loses its moral compass and stops viewing opposing groups as fellow human beings, the tragic escalation to physical violence becomes absolutely inevitable. History constantly warns us that whenever a culture decides that the ends justify the means, the darkest, most brutal parts of human nature are immediately unleashed. If you truly believe that your political enemies are fundamentally evil monsters trying to destroy your children's future, using violence against them suddenly feels completely justified. We are already seeing this deeply toxic mindset spill out from angry social media comment sections straight into the physical streets of our once peaceful cities. People are passionately justifying riots, physical assaults, and the destruction of private property because their broken moral framework tells them it is the right thing to do. The invisible lines of basic human decency have been completely erased, leaving a terrifying, lawless landscape where raw power and intimidation are the only things that matter. By aggressively removing the original cornerstone of our nation, we have intentionally built a massive, fragile skyscraper directly on top of shifting, unstable sand. We are proudly watching the grand, majestic walls of our society slowly buckle and warp, completely oblivious to the fact that the foundation is already gone. This moral rot has fundamentally changed the very DNA of our culture, turning a nation of united citizens into a fractured, paranoid collection of warring tribes. It is the exact, tragic scenario that ancient prophets warned about, describing a chaotic time when people would eagerly call evil good and good evil. When the internal moral restraints are completely severed, the only thing left to keep society from tearing itself apart is the physical threat of the law. But it really makes you wonder what happens when the very institutions designed to enforce those laws suddenly decide to stop playing by the rules. Growing up, we were all taught that Lady Justice wears a heavy blindfold for a very specific, undeniable reason. The entire foundation of a free society rests on the rock-solid promise that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their bank account or political bumper sticker. We genuinely believed that if you played by the rules and kept your nose clean, the system would fundamentally protect you from the bad guys. But honestly, if you take a hard look at what is happening in our courtrooms today, it is painfully obvious that the blindfold has been completely ripped off. The system is no longer looking at the actual crime being committed. It is carefully looking at the political affiliation of the person standing in the dock, when the scales of justice are deliberately tipped by the very people sworn to hold them. The entire illusion of a fair society completely shatters. What we are witnessing right now is the absolute terrifying weaponization of the legal system against ideological opponents. It really feels like we have entered a bizarre alternate reality where the actual law doesn't matter nearly as much as the specific team jersey you happen to be wearing. If you belong to the favored political class, you can literally commit blatant, undeniable crimes on national television and walk away without a single scratch. But if you dare to step out of line and hold the wrong political opinions, they will dig through decades of your life just to find a technicality to bury you. It is a classic textbook tactic straight out of the authoritarian playbook, designed entirely to completely silence dissent and crush anyone who challenges the status quo. When the heavy hammer of the law is exclusively used to crush political rivals, you no longer live in a republic. You live in a softly dressed dictatorship. And while the elites are busy turning the courtrooms into vicious political battlegrounds, the reality out on the actual streets has become an absolute lawless nightmare. We are literally watching the evening news show, people casually walking into major retail stores, filling up trash bags with expensive merchandise, and just strolling right out the front door. The police are often ordered to simply stand down, handcuffed by ridiculous political policies that heavily favor the criminals over the hard-working, law-abiding business owners. It is completely maddening to watch your own neighborhood actively deteriorate into a massive crime scene, while the local prosecutors essentially hand out get-out-of-jail-free cards. You honestly have to ask yourself how long a civilized society can possibly function when the basic social contract of punishing bad behavior is completely torn to shreds. The message being broadcasted to the criminal underworld is loud and clear. The gates are wide open, and there are absolutely zero consequences for your actions. This terrifying silence of the laws takes an unimaginably heavy psychological toll on the average everyday citizen who is just trying to raise their family in peace. When you finally realize that the local authorities are either unwilling or completely unable to protect your property, a very dark primal fear instantly takes over your mind. You start looking over your shoulder at the gas station, double-locking your doors, and eyeing your own neighbors with a deep, unsettling level of paranoid suspicion. The comfortable, comforting illusion that someone is coming to save you when you dial 911 completely evaporates, leaving you feeling entirely isolated and terribly vulnerable. It is a deeply exhausting, highly stressful way to live, constantly bracing for an impact that you know the broken system will never actually help you recover from. When the state completely fails its most basic, fundamental duty to maintain public order, The heavy burden of survival violently shifts directly onto the shoulders of the individual. If you want a perfect ancient description of what this exact kind of societal collapse looks like, you only need to flip open the Book of Judges. The ancient text perfectly summarizes the absolute chaos of a dying nation with one chilling phrase: "In those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." That isn't just a historical footnote. It is a terrifying, highly accurate prophecy of practical anarchy playing out in our modern, seemingly advanced cities. When people completely lose their faith in the official courts to deliver actual justice, they inevitably decide to take the law straight into their own hands. Vigilante justice and mob rule quickly become the new normal, entirely replacing careful, objective investigations with raw, emotional, and often highly destructive street vengeance. We are watching the fragile fabric of our civilized society unspool at an alarming rate, descending into a brutal, unforgiving environment where the strongest simply devour the weakest. This deliberate, highly calculated destruction of our legal and moral framework isn't just a random tragedy. It is actually clearing the way for something far more sinister. You simply cannot convince a strong, independent, and well-armed nation to voluntarily hand over their remaining freedoms unless they are absolutely terrified of the ongoing chaos. By intentionally allowing the streets to completely flood with violent anarchy and political division, the architects of this collapse are creating a massive, desperately aching void. They are expertly pushing the population to their absolute breaking point, making sure that the average citizen will eventually beg for someone to restore order at any cost. It is the ultimate masterfully designed problem-reaction solution paradigm, perfectly setting the global stage for the final act of this incredibly dark geopolitical play. It really makes you wonder who or what is quietly waiting in the wings, ready to offer a terrifying global solution the exact second the American obstacle is finally removed. If you take a massive step back and look at this entire agonizing process from a global perspective, a very chilling picture starts to emerge. The intentional, systematic dismantling of our society isn't just a random string of unfortunate political accidents or bad economic luck. We are essentially watching a highly controlled, incredibly precise demolition job designed to take out the biggest building on the block. For decades, this nation has stood as a massive, heavily armed roadblock, preventing a centralized global authority from taking absolute power. You simply cannot establish a dictatorial new world order while the most powerful country on earth still violently believes in personal freedom. So instead of fighting us on a traditional battlefield, they simply decided to let us completely destroy ourselves from the inside. Think about it logically. A global system of absolute control requires a population that is completely dependent, disarmed, and terrified. You can never force that kind of total submission onto a culture that still holds on to the heavy, unyielding principles of a constitutional republic. As long as millions of independent citizens own their own property, protect their own families, and speak their minds freely, the globalist agenda is completely stalled. Therefore, the only viable strategy to conquer this massive obstacle is to make the citizens so utterly exhausted that they willingly surrender their rights. They are deliberately turning up the heat, creating an unbearable environment of constant cultural warfare, soaring inflation, and terrifying street-level crime. It is a deeply psychological war of attrition, designed to slowly grind down our national spirit until we are begging for someone to save us. This brings us to the absolute core of the prophetic warning concerning the final, terrifying system of global governance that is rapidly approaching. The ancient texts describe a worldwide beast system that completely controls every single financial transaction, deciding exactly who gets to eat and who starves. Implementing a centralized digital financial cage is absolutely impossible if a massive, economically independent superpower simply refuses to play along with the rules. By intentionally crashing the American dollar and obliterating the middle class, they are essentially burning our lifeboats, so we have to board their massive global ship. When families are completely broke and absolutely desperate for food, they will gladly accept a new global digital system just to survive the week. We are being heavily cornered into a dark financial trap, expertly disguised as a much-needed economic rescue package for a dying nation. Historically speaking, the absolute easiest way to steal a nation's sovereignty is to offer them a warm blanket of security right in the middle of a freezing storm. When the internal riots finally reach a boiling point and the grocery store shelves are completely bare, the sheer panic will be absolutely unimaginable. People won't care about the Constitution, civil liberties, or freedom of speech when their children haven't eaten a decent meal in 3 days. In that exact moment of absolute, blinding desperation, a charismatic global leader will step onto the world stage offering a beautiful, seemingly perfect solution. They will promise to immediately restore the broken supply chains, silence the violent mobs, and bring total peace. But the hidden price tag will be our absolute freedom. It is the ultimate, incredibly deceptive Trojan horse, patiently waiting for our internal walls to finally collapse so it can casually roll right through the front gates. If you understand the ancient biblical timeline, you quickly realize that the rise of the Antichrist system is directly tied to the sudden removal of this American roadblock. The prophet John didn't see a powerful, independent, freedom-loving nation standing in defiant opposition to the beast during the final hours of human history. He saw an entire world completely united under one dark, oppressive banner, worshipping a single global authority out of sheer terror and absolute deception. For that specific, chilling prophecy to be entirely fulfilled, the unique American experiment must be violently and permanently removed from the geopolitical chessboard. We are not watching a tragic political failure. We are witnessing the mandatory, divinely predicted clearing of the stage for the final apocalyptic act. The controlled implosion of our society is simply the necessary prelude to the darkest, most deceptive period the world has ever seen. So, when you look out your window and see the incredibly rapid, heartbreaking deterioration of everything we once held dear, you finally understand the real agenda. It isn't about Republicans versus Democrats, or one ideology simply beating another in a fair, honest debate at the ballot box. This is a massive, highly spiritual demolition project, perfectly timed to create the exact chaotic vacuum the global system so desperately needs to take over. The massive protective dam has fundamentally cracked, and the dark, icy waters of a new world order are already starting to flood into our living rooms. We are standing right on the terrifying edge of a cliff, watching the last remnants of our independence completely crumble beneath our boots. It honestly forces you to ask a very dark, incredibly urgent question about what happens the exact second after this massive nation finally hits the ground. The absolute undeniable reality is that the collapse of the American empire isn't some distant, hypothetical future event. It is a live broadcast playing out right now. The Titanic hasn't just hit the iceberg. The icy water is already rapidly flooding into the lower compartments, dragging the massive ship down while people are still arguing over who gets to sit in the first-class dining room. The real question you have to ask yourself today is this: what exactly are you anchoring your life to? If your hope, your peace, and your family's ultimate future are entirely tied to a corrupt political system or a collapsing digital economy, you are going to go down with the ship. It is time to completely wake up. Stop wasting your energy fighting your own neighbors and start urgently preparing your soul and your household for the prophetic reality that is knocking on our front door. I want you to take a hard look at your own neighborhood and the breaking news today. Do you genuinely believe that America has already passed the absolute point of no return, or do you think there is still a tiny sliver of hope for national unity? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments down below. I want to know what you are seeing, and I read every single one of them. The mainstream media desperately wants you divided, distracted, and violently hating the person living right next door. We are here to completely pull back that heavy curtain and show you the undeniable prophetic truth. If you refuse to be blindly manipulated by a falling system, you need to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications to join the hidden channel. You cannot afford to let this collapse catch you completely off guard. But here is the most terrifying part. We just saw exactly how the American roadblock is being permanently removed. But what happens exactly 1 second after this massive collapse is complete? Click the video on your screen right now where I expose the 7 global steps of the Antichrist's infrastructure that are already fully built and patiently waiting for this exact fall. I will see you over there.